Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Mr. McMahon is a legendary rivalry that fascinated millions of viewers. The most famous storyline in WWE history that transformed pro wrestling into a real cultural phenomenon. Remember, in the previous episode, which I invite you to watch if you haven't seen it yet, we were able to learn who had the idea of Stone Cold's heel turn at WrestleMania 17. How this shocking moment, as well as backstage changes, caused hundreds of thousands of viewers to leave, and how creative disagreements led to the unexpected departure of the Rattlesnake from the company in 2002. In this final episode, you will discover how Stone Cold and Mr. McMahon met in a hotel in Houston and what they said to each other, how Austin thought he was dying the day before his WrestleMania 19 match, in which absolutely mind-blowing context Stone Cold did a stunner to his boss, but also Vince's legendary speech to induct his biggest rival into the Hall of Fame, and even what kind of relationship they have behind the scenes today. After all this very rich history between them, you are on the wrestling paradise, Stone Cold Steve Austin against Mr. McMahon, the iconic rivalry that captivated millions of viewers. Episode 5, let's go. When Stone Cold Steve Austin left the company being disappointed by the creative decisions around him in 2002, his rivalry with Vince McMahon went beyond fiction. Their behind-the-scenes relationship seemed to have reached a point of no return. With the real anti-Austin campaign that the company did after his sudden departure, we can say the two men had also become enemies in real life now. Personally, I am shocked to see how the situation could have been so negative between Austin and the Federation, considering that for about 5 years at that time, he had been the golden boy of the company, its golden goose, the one who the fans adored. He was the guy whose rich storyline with Vince had played a major role in the success of the Federation, whether it was its record ratings or its initial public offering in 1999. Obviously, this shows that no one is untouchable in Mr. McMahon's empire, even his biggest star. And precisely during this entire period in 2002 after he left, the Rattlesnake will also go through hard times in his personal life. While he was already publicly buried by his former employer, he also had problems with his then wife Deborah Marshall, who also worked at the company. Just a few days after he left, he got into a violent argument with her, and she called the police after getting hit by him. In the following weeks, after there has been an arrest warrant against him because of these domestic violence stories, he will eventually turn himself in to the police and will receive, in particular, a $1,000 fine and 80 hours of community service. The couple will divorce not long after, and Deborah will tell that Austin's moments of rage were due to the steroids he was taking. The fact is that between this situation and the image the company presented of him following his departure, the image of Stone Cold was damaged. For his part, he didn't answer any phone calls and didn't speak to anyone at that time. So at that moment, we can seriously ask ourselves a question. How will this situation be fixed? The answer to this question basically boils down to one key. The best commentator of all time, in my opinion, Jim Ross, despite his participation in the Confidential show in June 2002, which completely buried Austin, he still was one of his longtime friends, and he will be the one to initiate a real-life reconciliation between Stone Cold and Vince McMahon, after passionately commenting their on-screen adventures for years. While Vince, for his part, had tried to call Steve several times but only got silence from him. Jim Ross is going to write a card to Austin in which he told him that if he needed to talk to somebody, he was here. When Steve discovered it, he says it meant a lot to him and he took it literally. He called Jim and they spent 3 hours on the phone together. After this discussion, Steve will tell Jim Ross that he was okay to have a discussion with Vince, which was a big step forward for these two stubborn men with strong personalities by their own admission. In the fall of 2002, the boss and the man who made his life a living hell on screen for years will meet in a hotel in Houston to finally talk again. It should be noted that during the entire time of this discussion, Jim Ross was also at the hotel, even if he didn't wish to attend their reunion. What we know is that after the two men shook hands and a few moments of discomfort, which can be understandable given the situation, the Rattlesnake broke the ice by saying what happened. From there, they will explain their feelings to each other and eventually reconcile. And Steve will apologize for his abrupt departure from the company. About this discussion that he initiated, Jim Ross will say he is proud of this moment and that, according to him, it was a pivotal day in the company's history. He will also confide that Vince and Steve finally ended up doing what they should have done long before: communicate like two adults. This meeting at a Houston hotel will therefore enable the two men to make peace and work together again. The boss will, however, force him to apologize to the locker room leaders, including The Undertaker, of course, and Stone Cold will be fined $250,000. What should also be emphasized regarding this fine is that in the interview the two men did on the WWE network at the end of 2014, the Rattlesnake told that initially Vince wanted to fine him $650,000, but when Steve heard this amount he thought it was way too high. At that moment the boss asked him how much the fine should be. According to him, and Steve will say $250,000, which will eventually be the final sum. When Austin asked him in their interview if the boss would have accepted if he had told him an amount of $1.25, the latter refused to answer. Anyway, their relationship will start off on the right foot again, and this period in which they had real problems behind the scenes can really be considered a chapter in their rivalry because it almost put an end to it. Taking a step back on his behavior following his creative disagreements with the Federation, Austin said he reacted in the worst possible way to this situation. He said that what he did would have been professional suicide for almost anyone. He lost a lot of money in the company too. He declared it was a dark time in his life that he handled very badly. He said it was all his fault in this situation. In the end, Steve regretted what he did in 2002, but fortunately, it wasn't fatal to his relationship with the Federation since he will make his official comeback there at the beginning of 2003. He will in particular have a third match at WrestleMania against his other big rival, The Rock, the one who, in June 2002, had implied in a promo that if Austin didn't want to be in the Federation, he just had to leave or rather get the F out, as he said. What we can note about this return to Vince McMahon's company in 2003 is that it will lead to the end of his in-ring career for now. Indeed, during the build-up of this match, the Rattlesnake will again have bad news about his body, and he will make the decision that this WrestleMania 19 match against The Rock will be the final one of his career. However, as Jim Ross revealed in his podcast, Austin didn't want it to be presented as his last match because he thought that information didn't contribute anything to his rivalry with The Rock on a personal note. I would like to say I would have preferred to see a final confrontation between Steve and Mr. McMahon at that WrestleMania, since it was really supposed to be his last match. I find it even more frustrating because Vince had a match against Hulk Hogan on this same show, which means he was available to wrestle at this show. And even though I love this rivalry and their extraordinary chemistry, The Rock and Stone Cold had already faced each other 2 times at the Showcase of the Immortals, in 1999 and in 2001. Can you only imagine Steve Austin ending his pro wrestling career with a final WrestleMania war with his biggest enemy, Mr. McMahon? In addition, the storyline was obvious with all their years of feuding, and we can imagine Vince McMahon wanting to have the last word against his rival by beating him at WrestleMania. Personally, I think it's too bad they didn't do it, but you'll see that a few years later, they will have several very significant interactions at the grandest stage of them also. Make sure to stay until the end of the video to discover how they will still take place despite Steve Austin's retirement in 2003. The absolutely crazy thing about this Stone Cold WrestleMania 19 match is that it almost turned into a disaster. Indeed, the day before the show, after working out at the gym with his friend Kevin Nash, where Austin realized his legs were shaking, he took the elevator at the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Seattle, the city where WrestleMania was set up that year. And then he had what he described as a massive anxiety attack, a big pain in his chest, and he thought it was the end for him. About this scene, Steve tells he thought he was dying. He said his heart was beating so hard. At that moment, he will be lucky that an employee of the Federation saw him, immediately understood there was a problem, and urgently called 911. At the hospital, Austin will learn that this incident was due to dehydration, and fortunately, it didn't prevent him from wrestling the next day against The Rock. The latter will beat him and tell him he loves him and thank him for everything he has done for him in his career. It was a real special and emotional moment for both men. Anyway, after WrestleMania 19, several questions arise. Now that he can't have any more matches, will the Rattlesnake still be involved in some way in pro wrestling? If so, will his iconic rivalry with Mr. McMahon have a new episode, or if not, will it have new memorable moments? In the spring of 2003, the future was a big mystery. In April 2003, the Stamford Federation will face a new challenge. How can it continue to use Stone Cold Steve Austin, its biggest star, while he can no longer wrestle? At that moment, the Federation will turn to the most obvious option, and which is nevertheless new in the Rattlesnake's career. It will offer him a reconversion in other on-screen roles in which he won't need to have matches. First of all, at the end of April, he will be appointed Monday Night Raw co-general manager by Linda McMahon, Vince's wife, the same woman who, in 1999, with her daughter Stephanie, had allowed him to become CEO of the company on screen for several weeks. This is a role he will share with Eric Bischoff, the former WCW president, and a new position in which Steve will have a lot of fun, as he said. This will enable him to create entertaining moments, especially since he had a real chemistry with Bischoff, with whom he could easily improvise. I think it's still incredibly ironic that Stone Cold is becoming an authority figure on Raw while he had been an untamable rebel for years. But we can also think that, on the contrary, he will now be able to impose his own law, especially since he has the stature and personality to have such a role. He will eventually only stay a few months in this position, which he thinks is too bad, but at the end of the year, he will have a gimmick that suits him even better, in my opinion. He will be the Sheriff of Raw, the man who makes people follow the law. Apparently, Vince McMahon had that idea, and what will characterize the Rattlesnake in this period when he will be the sheriff is in particular his quad bike, which will become his official vehicle. Personally, I think it was great to see him arrive at full speed at the ring and then go around it. Look at the way he drives. Without the shadow of a doubt, the quad bike fitted perfectly with his unpredictable and sometimes wild side. In my opinion, it was really the best authority function he could have, and besides, it will lead to a new legendary scene in his long rivalry with Mr. McMahon. On March 1st, 2004, he will chase his lifelong enemy with his quad bike, and this whole scene is absolutely awesome. I'm really a fan of the way he drives the quad bike, and that moment when Vince is down and Steve threatens to run him over is incredible. Look at these facial expressions of the boss once again. His acting is extraordinary, and we can highlight the fact this is the first time in their history that the Rattlesnake finds himself in a position where he chases his rival with a vehicle. It must also be said that seeing Stone Cold wreaking havoc on his boss using a quad bike brings back good memories and obviously makes us think back to all their iconic scenes during the Attitude Era. We can say that this scene in 2004 made us nostalgic for the best moments of their storyline. And in itself, it was very entertaining, with that moment when Vince does a remarkable jump to avoid Stone Cold who rushes at him, and the one where Austin goes with the quad bike on the roof of the limousine in which his boss was hiding. We could have mixed feelings about this scene. On the one hand, it is funny, tinged with nostalgia, and it's always a pleasure to see Austin victimize Mr. McMahon because both men are great in their acting and their respective characters. But on the other hand, seeing their excellent chemistry again, and the kind of scenes they can offer to viewers, makes us regret that they didn't try to offer more than one-shot moments between the two men. It would have been nice to see a real new chapter in their rivalry, in which they would both be authority figures, and in which they could fight for the supremacy of their show, for example, or for other issues. To compensate for the fact the Rattlesnake can no longer wrestle, they could each have designated wrestlers to represent them, have their own factions. Of course, it could still remind us of things that have already been done in the past on certain aspects, but I really think they could have done more at the time when Stone Cold was the Sheriff of Raw. This is even more true since Mr. McMahon has always gotten the best out of Austin. It's against him that he is at his best, and I think it's too bad the Federation basically just created moments between them from 2003 and no new storylines. And precisely, there will be another one on December 22nd, 2003, when the Federation will do its tribute to the Truth Show in Iraq for American soldiers. In a scene that is still incredible, if we take a step back, we will see Vince McMahon take on Santa Claus, who will actually turn out to be Stone Cold Steve Austin, to the delight of the crowd. He will do them a favor, as he did so often all these years. So it's true we can say it's something we've already seen many times. We might find that it's kind of lazy to just do stunners over and over again, but we must realize that these stunners on McMahon have impacted millions of viewers. That it's like fan service, a bit like a music band that would play its biggest hit at each concert. Anyway, what will remain historical despite everything, whatever we think about it, is that their rivalry will have been written all over the world, including in Iraq in the same logic. There will be other scenes in the following years in which they will offer new significant moments to the fans between Stone Cold and Mr. McMahon, without creating real new stories, unfortunately. For example, we think of the Homecoming episode of Raw in October 2005, when the show returned to the USA Network after 5 years on Spike TV. To celebrate that, Austin will appear, which will become more and more rare over time and gratify the entire McMahon family with stunners. First Vince, then Shane, Stephanie, and finally Linda. That was unheard of, and of course a nice nod to one of the most memorable rivalries in the Red brand history. I would like to take this opportunity to say I am always impressed when I see how Stone Cold grabs beer cans in the air with only one hand so easily, but that's probably because he did it for many years. The Rattlesnake will also be involved in the Battle of the Billionaires at WrestleMania 23 in 2007 between Vince McMahon and Donald Trump, since he will be the referee of this match between the representatives of the Billionaires, Bobby Lashley and Umaga. This memorable event will of course be an opportunity for him to stun the boss again, but above all to make him undergo a new humiliating and totally unprecedented act. He will participate in the shaving of Mr. McMahon. This adds to the already long list of crazy things he has done to Vince finally, still in this logic of creating new isolated moments that appeal to the nostalgia of the fans. We are going to have a scene on Raw on December 10th, 2007. To celebrate the 15th anniversary of the show, Vince McMahon will proclaim himself as the biggest superstar in Raw history, then successively get attacked by Mankind, The Undertaker, and finally Stone Cold. What is really absurd in this scene is that Vince is already knocked out when Steve arrives, and he will do a promo while Mr. McMahon is lying on the mat next to him. He will help him get up, pretend to share a beer with him to celebrate this anniversary, and then finally perform his famous finisher on him, which really seems destined to happen every time the two individuals are together in the same ring. This is more or less what will also happen at the 25th anniversary of Raw on January 22nd, 2018, where another very symbolic moment happened where Vince will believe that he has escaped the usual stunner after explaining that he is much older now and after seeing his son Shane undergo it. He will even have a hug with the Rattlesnake, but in the end he will get stunned, as always. Obviously, it was meant to be that for the 25th anniversary of Raw, this legendary scene had to be recreated. Even if they didn't revive the rivalry with real news stories over the years, we can at least recognize the company's desire to offer multiple feel-good moments to the fans with its most popular babyface of all time. It's a hit that viewers can't seem to get enough of, despite all these years. However, it was in 2009 that the company paid its most beautiful tribute, in my opinion, to its most famous rivalry. On April 4th, 2009, it was time for the Texas Rattlesnake to enter the WWE Hall of Fame, which was of course obvious given his importance in the Stamford Federation history. But what is even more memorable and symbolic is that the person who will make his introductory speech will be the boss himself, Mr. McMahon. It should be noted that this is one of the very rare occasions that Vince has introduced a superstar into the Hall of Fame himself, and there couldn't be a better person to do it for than Stone Cold. It is a huge symbol to see Vince and Steve more than 10 years after the birth of their rivalry at that time, in suits for what is the biggest possible honor for a wrestler. We can also notice that the track in the video of the best moments of the Texans' career is the song Cult of Personality, which will become CM Punk's theme song a few years later. It was really a very symbolic scene, and I think it's a great way to honor this rivalry, to find its two protagonists years later in this situation. In his speech at the Hall of Fame, Mr. McMahon will say many memorable things. He will joke by saying he thinks Stone Cold Steve Austin hates him, with all the things he did to him. He described Steve as the most popular superstar in the company's history, while not being a traditional babyface and breaking all the rules. He celebrated all the records that the Federation broke thanks to the Rattlesnake. He also said that when they were in the ring together, Steve has broken McMahon's jaw several times. He revealed that Austin apologized to him several times in the ring and beat him up so violently that Vince forgot his own name. He finally described him as the biggest pro wrestling superstar of all time. About this scene, the Rattlesnake confided it was special for him to have Vince McMahon induct him to the Hall of Fame, that he has a special bond with him. And finally, after experiencing ups and downs in their relationship behind the curtain, and after writing their story for years on screen, these two wrestling icons were able to put a glorious and poetic end to their rivalry. In 2022, 25 years after it all started between them on a September evening at Madison Square Garden, Austin and McMahon were able to have what could perhaps be the epilogue of their rivalry. At WrestleMania 38, when the Texas Rattlesnake came out of retirement to face Kevin Owens, which was already completely unexpected and unlikely, they are going to have a moment together that, despite its simplicity, was still very significant, because of all these years that went by since it all started. After Vince faced Pat McAfee, who himself had a match against Austin Theory just before Stone Cold will arrive, to the big surprise of the 65,653 people in the stadium. As usual, he will let McMahon believe that he's going to spare him by sharing a beer with him. But the boss falls for it once again and gets stunned, perhaps the worst stunner of all time, by the way. Let's say Vince's selling wasn't the best, but the Rattlesnake will laugh, just like his colleague Mick Foley when he discovered the scene on his television. Anyway, 25 years after the first stunner, things came full circle. And what better place than WrestleMania to celebrate this anniversary? If this moment is indeed the last ever between Austin and McMahon, we can say they were able to end on a stage worthy of its importance. So it's true that in itself, since 2003, they have essentially made Stone Cold come back to give Vince a stunner every time. But I still have to admit that seeing the two men, at respectively 57 years old for Steve and 76 years old for Vince, offer us a short trip down memory lane was magical. We realized even more the time that went by since the beginning of their storyline, this long journey, the trials of life, the collection of iconic scenes, the millions of viewers, the Federation's success in which it had a crucial role. We realized that these are two characters who needed each other to be at their best. Their intensity, their charisma, their acting, Their complicity together are among the best in business. As Jim Ross says, they always had a good chemistry. He doesn't remember ever seeing them spend hours before a show preparing what they were going to do. They knew where they had to go, but above all, they had a great chemistry and they lived their storyline. It worked very well, and he thinks all their booking was perfect. It's also beautiful that after everything they've been through on screen, but also behind the scenes, Austin and McMahon have developed a strong bond. The Rattlesnake describes his boss as a father figure, a brother, a mentor, a best friend, and an enemy. It is obvious that this special bond has helped them to get the best out of each other. This rivalry illustrates that a storyline is never more interesting than when its protagonists are emotionally invested in their roles. As Austin said, their relationship with Vince is strong. He likes him and he's sure he probably likes him too. As he admitted, there has been animosity many times when he did certain things. Steve has nothing but respect for this guy and they get along very well today. He thinks this rivalry was the most important of his career, a rivalry that, according to Jim Ross, was the symbol of the Attitude Era. What other storyline lasted 25 years with real storylines during several months or one-shot scenes? What other storyline has captivated literally millions of people in front of their televisions and in the arenas to the point of breaking ratings? Merch sales and attendance as records? Without it, would the WWE have won the war against WCW and still exist? Would the company have gone public? The impact of this rivalry has been tremendous. It has made pro wrestling mainstream for several years to a point where young people were talking about it with each other, where adults were discussing it at work. As Stone Cold said, even people who weren't wrestling fans started watching because it was the common man who was bullying his boss, something that can resonate with millions of human beings and not just inside the circle of hardcore wrestling fans. The Rattlesnake summarized this amazing dynamic he had with his greatest enemy by saying the energy that Vince had in the ring with him, the love and hatred of the spectators, the energy they projected on each other was a big force. Steve says that as an opponent, Vince was really very clumsy, but that he was an extraordinary showman. Together they provided emotions and made millions of people love wrestling. They told a story that could speak to anyone. Through vehicles, stunners, henchmen, evil plans, beer cans, unforgettable scenes, they were able to captivate the crowds, and for all these reasons, it is most likely the most important rivalry of all time. And this is how our series on the iconic rivalry between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mister McMahon ends. We were able to dive in this storyline that began with a stunner in New York in September 1997, and which, in the meantime, has created dozens of legendary moments, whether it's the charisma of its actors, the time it lasted, the twists, the cliffhangers, or even the often exciting stakes. This saga had all the ingredients to be as interesting to follow as a television soap opera, and it makes me offer you a debate. Do you think pro wrestling is at its best when it focuses on telling universal storylines to a mainstream audience, or rather when it focuses more on the idea of offering good matches to fans who already know wrestling? Tell us what you think. It will be great to discuss it together in the comments and to exchange our opinions. We can say that this rivalry is stupendous. I hope you had a good time watching this video, and I invite you to stay on the Paradise of Wrestling to look at some other ones. See you right away.
And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so. What?